Question 1. Compliance review shows that during a sensitive insurance fraud investigation, an investigator discovered that a key piece of physical evidence, a damaged vehicle component, was temporarily stored in an unsecured location by a junior team member for approximately 2 hours before being properly logged into the evidence locker. The investigator is aware of this lapse. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the investigator? Option A. Proceed with the investigation using the evidence, assuming no tampering occurred during the brief unsecured period, and address the documentation later if questioned. Option B. Immediately document the deviation in the chain of custody, report it to their supervisor, and initiate the established protocol for addressing such breaches to ensure the evidence's integrity is properly managed and recorded. Option C. Retrospectively alter the evidence log to reflect that the evidence was secured immediately to avoid complications in the investigation. Option D. Discreetly resecure the evidence and instruct the junior team member to not mention the incident to anyone to prevent unnecessary procedural complications. Correct answer is B. Immediately document the deviation in the chain of custody, report it to their supervisor, and initiate the established protocol for addressing such breaches to ensure the evidence's integrity is properly managed and recorded. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it directly impacts the integrity of evidence, a cornerstone of insurance fraud investigations. The chain of custody is a critical procedural safeguard designed to ensure that evidence is handled in a way that maintains its authenticity and admissibility. Deviations from established procedures, even if seemingly minor or well-intentioned, can undermine the entire investigation, leading to the exclusion of crucial evidence and potentially jeopardizing legal proceedings. The ethical dilemma lies in balancing the urgency of an investigation with the absolute requirement for meticulous adherence to procedural safeguards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves immediately documenting the deviation and initiating the process to rectify the chain of custody. This demonstrates a commitment to maintaining the integrity of the evidence. By promptly reporting the issue and following established protocols for addressing such breaches, the investigator ensures that the evidence's reliability is preserved and that any potential challenges to its admissibility are proactively managed. This aligns with the fundamental ethical and regulatory principles of thoroughness, accuracy, and accountability in evidence handling, as mandated by the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative, CIFR. Exams focus on regulatory frameworks governing insurance investigations. Incorrect approaches analysis. Failing to document the deviation and proceeding with the investigation without addressing the break in the chain of custody is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This approach disregards the fundamental principles of evidence integrity, potentially rendering the evidence inadmissible and weakening the fraud case. It suggests a lack of diligence and an unprofessional disregard for established procedures. Attempting to fix the chain of custody by retrospectively altering documentation without proper authorization or without following established corrective procedures is also a serious ethical and regulatory breach. This action constitutes falsification of records, which directly undermines the trustworthiness of the evidence and the investigator. It violates principles of honesty and transparency in evidence handling. Ignoring the deviation and assuming the evidence is still valid because the investigator believes it was not tampered with is a dangerous and unprofessional approach. While the investigator may have good intentions, subjective belief does not replace objective procedural adherence. This failure to follow established protocols can lead to the introduction of unreliable evidence and a compromised investigation, violating the core tenets of evidence management. Professional reasoning. Professionals in insurance fraud investigation must adopt a proactive and meticulous approach to evidence handling. When a deviation in the chain of custody occurs, the immediate steps should be: 1. Recognize and acknowledge the deviation. 2. Document the exact nature of the deviation and the circumstances surrounding it. 3. Immediately report the deviation to the appropriate supervisor or designated authority. 4. Follow established protocols for rectifying the chain of custody, which may involve resecuring the evidence, redocumenting its handling, and obtaining necessary authorizations. This systematic process ensures that evidence integrity is maintained and that the investigation remains compliant with all regulatory and ethical standards. Question 2. Benchmark analysis indicates that investigators often face ethical dilemmas when policy language appears to be stretched by an insured's explanation of an event. A policyholder reports a loss, explaining that their vehicle was damaged when a flock of unusually large, aggressive pigeons attacked it while parked in their driveway, causing significant dents and scratches. The policy in question defines an accident as a sudden and unforeseen event resulting in damage or injury. The investigator suspects this explanation is fabricated to avoid a deductible or to claim damage that occurred elsewhere. What is the most appropriate initial approach for the investigator? Option A. Immediately classify the claim as suspicious and initiate a formal fraud investigation based on the unusual nature of the explanation, focusing on gathering evidence to disprove the pigeon attack. Option B. Accept the insured's explanation without further scrutiny and process the claim as a covered loss, prioritizing customer satisfaction and avoiding potential complaints. Option C. Interpret the policy's definition of accident in the narrowest possible way, concluding that a pigeon attack cannot be a sudden and unforeseen event, and therefore deny the claim outright. Option D. Review the policy's definition of accident and occurrence in conjunction with the insured's explanation, and if ambiguity exists regarding whether the described event constitutes a covered accident, consult with the underwriting department for clarification before proceeding with further investigation. Correct answer is A. Immediately classify the claim as suspicious and initiate a formal fraud investigation based on the unusual nature of the explanation, focusing on gathering evidence to disprove the pigeon attack. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to balance the need to uncover potential fraud with the ethical obligation to accurately interpret and apply policy language. Misinterpreting coverage provisions can lead to either an unjustified denial of a legitimate claim or an improper payment on a fraudulent one. The investigator must demonstrate a nuanced understanding of policy terms and conditions, avoiding assumptions or biases. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the policy language, specifically the definitions of accident and occurrence, and how they relate to the described event. This approach is ethically and regulatorily sound because it adheres to the principle of good faith and fair dealing, which is a cornerstone of insurance regulation in the U.S. Specifically, it aligns with state insurance laws that mandate insurers act in good faith when investigating and settling claims. By focusing on the precise wording of the policy and seeking clarification from the underwriting department if ambiguity exists, the investigator ensures that the coverage determination is based on the contractual agreement between the insurer and the insured, rather than on suspicion alone. This upholds the integrity of the claims process and protects both the insurer from unwarranted payouts and the insured from unfair claim denials. An incorrect approach would be to immediately flag the claim as fraudulent based solely on the insured's unusual explanation. This fails to acknowledge that policy language can be complex and that unusual events can sometimes fall within covered parameters. Ethically, this approach violates the duty of good faith by prejudging the claim without a thorough investigation into the policy's applicability. Regulatorily, it could lead to a violation of unfair claims settlement practices if the claim is improperly denied. Another incorrect approach would be to accept the insured's explanation at face value and close the claim without further investigation, despite the unusual circumstances. While this avoids potential accusations of bad faith denial, it fails to fulfill the investigator's responsibility to identify and investigate potential fraud. This can lead to financial losses for the insurer and contribute to the overall problem of insurance fraud, which ultimately impacts policyholders through increased premiums. Ethically, it represents a dereliction of duty. Regulatorily, it could be seen as a failure to conduct a reasonable investigation, potentially violating claims handling regulations. A third incorrect approach would be to interpret the policy language in the most restrictive way possible to automatically deny the claim. This demonstrates a lack of objectivity and a failure to consider all reasonable interpretations of the policy. Ethically, it is a breach of the duty of good faith and fair dealing. Regulatorily, it could be considered an unfair claims settlement practice if the interpretation is not supported by the policy's plain language or established legal precedent. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Understand the claim facts thoroughly. 2. Obtain and meticulously review the relevant insurance policy, paying close attention to definitions and insuring agreements. 3. Identify any ambiguities in the policy language. 4. If ambiguity exists, consult with the underwriting department or legal counsel for interpretation. 5. Gather all necessary evidence to support or refute the claim, including the insured statements, third-party reports, and any other relevant documentation. 6. Make a coverage determination based on the policy language, the evidence, and applicable laws, acting in good faith and fair dealing throughout the process. 7. Document all steps taken and the rationale for the coverage decision. Question 3. Governance review demonstrates a pattern of high referral volumes from a specific medical group to a diagnostic imaging facility. Further investigation reveals that the medical group's primary physician, Dr. Anya Sharma, also holds a significant minority ownership stake in the imaging facility. While Dr. Sharma's group refers a substantial number of patients to the facility, there is no explicit written agreement detailing financial incentives for these referrals. However, the imaging facility's profits have seen a marked increase correlating with the rise in referrals from Dr. Sharma's practice. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative, CIFR, to take? Option A. Immediately report Dr. Sharma and the imaging facility to law enforcement for potential fraud, based on the high referral volume and Dr. Sharma's ownership stake. Option B. Focus the investigation solely on the volume of referrals, without delving into the financial arrangements or ownership structures, to determine if the volume itself is indicative of an issue. Option C. Conclude that no fraud has occurred as there is no explicit written agreement for kickbacks, and the referrals may simply reflect patient preference or the quality of services offered by the imaging facility. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive investigation into the financial relationships and referral patterns between Dr. Sharma's medical group and the diagnostic imaging facility, seeking evidence of illegal kickbacks or prohibited self-referrals under applicable insurance fraud statutes. The correct answer is D. Initiate a comprehensive investigation into the financial relationships and referral patterns between Dr. Sharma's medical group and the diagnostic imaging facility, seeking evidence of illegal kickbacks or prohibited self-referrals under applicable insurance fraud statutes. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative, CIFR, to navigate the complex interplay between business relationships and potential fraudulent activities within the healthcare provider network. The core challenge lies in identifying subtle indicators of kickbacks and self-referrals that, while sometimes appearing as legitimate business practices, can mask illegal schemes designed to inflate healthcare costs and defraud insurers. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between ethical business arrangements and violations of insurance fraud regulations. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation that meticulously gathers evidence of the financial relationships and referral patterns. This includes scrutinizing contracts, payment histories, and referral sources to establish a clear link between financial incentives and patient referrals. The regulatory and ethical justification for this approach stems from the CIFR duty to uphold the integrity of the insurance system by identifying and preventing fraudulent activities. Specifically, regulations governing insurance fraud prohibit schemes that involve kickbacks and illegal self-referrals, as these practices violate fair market principles and lead to increased costs for policyholders and insurers. The CIFR must act diligently to uncover such schemes, adhering to the principles of due diligence and professional responsibility. An incorrect approach that involves dismissing the initial findings due to the perceived legitimacy of the business relationships would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This overlooks the potential for sophisticated fraud schemes that are designed to appear legitimate. It fails to meet the professional obligation to investigate suspicious activity thoroughly, potentially allowing fraudulent practices to continue unchecked and causing financial harm to the insurance provider. Another incorrect approach, such as immediately reporting the providers without sufficient evidence, would also constitute a regulatory and ethical failure. While prompt action is important, premature accusations without a robust investigation can lead to reputational damage for the providers and legal repercussions for the insurer. It demonstrates a lack of due process and a failure to adhere to the investigative standards required for fraud detection. A third incorrect approach, focusing solely on the volume of referrals without examining the underlying financial arrangements, would be insufficient. While high referral volumes can be an indicator, The absence of a direct financial incentive or a prohibited self-referral arrangement means the activity may not be fraudulent. This approach fails to address the specific elements required to prove kickback or illegal self-referral schemes. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic, evidence-based investigation. First, identify red flags or suspicious patterns. Second, gather all relevant documentation and data. Third, analyze the gathered information to establish a clear connection between financial incentives and referral practices, looking for violations of specific anti-kickback statutes and self-referral prohibitions relevant to the jurisdiction. Fourth, consult with legal counsel to ensure the investigation and any subsequent actions are compliant with all applicable laws and regulations. Finally, document all findings and actions meticulously. Question 4. Strategic planning requires an insurance fraud investigator to identify potential organized fraud rings. Given the vast amount of data available, which approach best balances the need for comprehensive analysis with regulatory compliance and ethical data handling? Option A. Focus solely on individual claim suspiciousness flags without exploring interclaim relationships or entity connections. Option B. Utilize link analysis tools to map relationships between entities based on specific, relevant data points that suggest coordinated fraudulent activity, such as shared identifiers or unusual claim patterns. Option C. Share raw, unanalyzed claims data with external consultants to conduct an independent review for potential fraud indicators. Option D. Broadly analyze all available customer and claims data to identify any anomalies, regardless of their direct connection to suspected fraud. The correct answer is D. Broadly analyze all available customer and claims data to identify any anomalies, regardless of their direct connection to suspected fraud. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to balance the need for thorough data analysis with the ethical and regulatory obligations concerning data privacy and the scope of an investigation. The investigator must leverage available data to identify potential fraud rings without overstepping legal boundaries or compromising sensitive information unnecessarily. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the investigative process is both effective and compliant. The correct approach involves utilizing link analysis tools to map relationships between entities, individuals, businesses, claims, based on specific, relevant data points that are directly indicative of potential fraudulent activity. This approach is justified by regulatory frameworks that permit the use of data for fraud detection, provided it is done in a targeted and lawful manner. Specifically, regulations governing data usage in investigations emphasize proportionality and relevance. Link analysis, when applied to data points such as shared addresses, common medical providers across multiple unrelated claims, or unusual claim submission patterns involving the same adjusters, directly supports the identification of coordinated fraudulent schemes. This aligns with the principle of using data to uncover patterns that deviate from normal business practices and suggest intentional deception, a core tenet of insurance fraud investigation. An incorrect approach that focuses on broadly analyzing all available data without a specific hypothesis or a clear link to potential fraud is ethically and regulatorily flawed. This could lead to the indiscriminate collection and analysis of personal information, violating privacy laws and potentially leading to accusations of overreach or phishing expeditions. Such an approach fails to adhere to the principle of data minimization and purpose limitation, which are fundamental in data protection regulations. Another incorrect approach that involves sharing raw, unanalyzed data with external parties without proper authorization or a clear investigative purpose is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This breaches confidentiality agreements, data privacy laws, and could expose the insurer to legal liabilities and reputational damage. Investigations must maintain data integrity and control access to sensitive information. Finally, an approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or unsubstantiated suspicions without attempting to corroborate them with data analysis is professionally weak. While suspicions are a starting point, effective fraud investigation requires empirical evidence derived from data. This approach fails to meet the standard of due diligence and can lead to misdirected investigations and wasted resources. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with defining the investigative objective and identifying specific fraud typologies to look for. This is followed by a targeted data collection strategy, focusing on data points most likely to reveal the suspected fraud. Link analysis tools should then be applied to this relevant data to identify connections and patterns. Throughout the process, adherence to data privacy regulations, internal policies, and ethical guidelines is paramount. Any data sharing or further investigative steps must be justified by the findings and conducted within legal and ethical boundaries. Question 5. Market research demonstrates that sophisticated insurance fraud schemes often involve subtle deviations from typical claim behaviors. A new fraud detection system has been implemented that flags claims exhibiting unusual patterns, such as a sudden increase in claim frequency for a specific type of incident, or a claim amount significantly outside the historical average for similar cases. An investigator receives a report listing several such flagged claims. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and regulatory compliant approach for the investigator to take? Option A. Prioritize the flagged claims based on the perceived severity of the anomaly and proceed with a cursory review to expedite the resolution of potential fraud cases. Option B. Immediately initiate a full fraud investigation for every claim flagged by the system, assuming that any deviation from the norm indicates fraudulent intent. Option C. Review the flagged claims to understand the nature of the anomaly and gather additional contextual information before determining if further investigation is warranted. Option D. Dismiss all flagged claims that exhibit unusual characteristics, as these are likely to be attempts at fraud and do not warrant further insurer resources. The correct answer is B. Immediately initiate a full fraud investigation for every claim flagged by the system, assuming that any deviation from the norm indicates fraudulent intent. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to balance the need for efficient fraud detection with the imperative to adhere to regulatory frameworks and ethical guidelines. Investigator must move beyond simple rule-based flagging to a more sophisticated understanding of anomaly detection, recognizing that genuine, albeit unusual, claims can exist. The pressure to reduce fraud losses must not override the obligation to conduct thorough, unbiased investigations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves utilizing advanced analytical techniques to identify deviations from established patterns of legitimate claims, while also incorporating human oversight and contextual understanding. This aligns with the principles of responsible data analysis and investigation mandated by regulatory bodies overseeing insurance practices. Specifically, it acknowledges that anomaly detection is a tool to flag potential issues for further investigation, not definitive proof of fraud. The process requires investigators to examine the flagged anomalies in the context of the claimant's history, policy details, and other relevant information to determine if the deviation is indeed indicative of fraudulent activity or a legitimate, albeit unusual, circumstance. This methodical, evidence-based approach is crucial for maintaining fairness and compliance with investigative standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that relies solely on the volume of flagged anomalies without further investigation is incorrect because it risks misclassifying legitimate claims as fraudulent. This can lead to unwarranted scrutiny of policyholders, damage the insurer's reputation, and potentially violate consumer protection regulations that prohibit unfair or deceptive practices. Bypasses the critical step of verifying the nature of the anomaly. An approach that dismisses any claim exhibiting unusual characteristics, regardless of other supporting evidence, is also incorrect. This demonstrates a rigid and unsophisticated application of pattern recognition, failing to account for the diversity of legitimate insurance events. Such an approach can lead to the rejection of valid claims, resulting in customer dissatisfaction and potential legal challenges related to breach of contract or bad faith claims handling. It ignores the principle that anomalies are indicators, not conclusions. An approach that prioritizes speed of resolution over the thoroughness of the anomaly investigation is incorrect. While efficiency is important, regulatory frameworks emphasize due diligence and fair claims handling. Rushing to judgment based on preliminary anomaly detection without adequate investigation can lead to errors in fraud assessment, potentially resulting in both missed fraud and wrongly accused policyholders, both of which carry significant regulatory and ethical implications. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach anomaly detection and pattern recognition as tools to guide investigative efforts, not as definitive fraud detection mechanisms. The process should involve 1. Identifying potential anomalies using analytical tools. 2. Contextualizing flagged anomalies by gathering and reviewing all relevant claim information, policy details, and claimant history. 3. Applying critical thinking and investigative judgment to determine if the anomaly in context suggests fraudulent intent or a legitimate, albeit unusual, claim. 4. Documenting the findings and the rationale for any conclusions drawn, ensuring compliance with all applicable regulations and ethical standards. Question 6. The assessment process reveals a shipment of high-value electronics reported as lost in transit. The policyholder has provided a bill of lading and a carrier's acknowledgement of receipt, but the carrier's subsequent tracking information shows the shipment was delivered to a different, albeit nearby, address. The policyholder insists the shipment was never received at the intended destination. What is the most appropriate next step for a certified insurance fraud representative, CIFR, in this situation, adhering strictly to the regulatory framework and guidelines for this exam? Option A. Advise the policyholder to file a police report for theft, as this will provide official documentation supporting their claim of non-receipt. Option B. Contact the policyholder's business associates to inquire about any potential involvement in a scheme to defraud the insurance company. Option C. Request detailed proof of delivery from the carrier, including photographic evidence of the delivery location and recipient signature, and interview the policyholder to understand the discrepancy and their actions upon notification of the delivery. Option D. Immediately deny the claim based on the discrepancy in the delivery address, as this indicates potential misrepresentation by the policyholder. Correct answer is D. Immediately deny the claim based on the discrepancy in the delivery address, as this indicates potential misrepresentation by the policyholder. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a complex scenario involving potential cargo and transportation insurance fraud, presenting a professional challenge due to the need to balance investigative thoroughness with adherence to regulatory frameworks and ethical obligations. The challenge lies in distinguishing legitimate claims from fraudulent ones, requiring a nuanced understanding of policy terms, evidence gathering, and stakeholder interactions, all within the strict confines of the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative, CIFR, exam-specified regulatory jurisdiction. The correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based investigation that prioritizes factual accuracy and compliance with all applicable laws and regulations governing insurance claims and fraud detection. This approach requires the representative to meticulously gather and analyze all relevant documentation, conduct thorough interviews, and consult with subject matter experts where necessary, while maintaining impartiality and confidentiality. The regulatory justification stems from the CIFR mandate to uphold the integrity of the insurance industry by identifying and preventing fraudulent activities. Ethical considerations demand fairness to the policyholder and the insurer, ensuring that claims are processed accurately and that no fraudulent activity goes unaddressed, thereby protecting the public interest and the financial stability of the insurance market. An incorrect approach that relies solely on anecdotal evidence or assumptions without substantiation would fail to meet the evidentiary standards required for fraud investigation and could lead to wrongful accusations or the overlooking of genuine fraud. This violates the principle of due diligence and could expose the representative and their organization to legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach that involves prematurely concluding the investigation based on initial suspicions, without exhausting all reasonable avenues of inquiry, demonstrates a lack of professional rigor and a failure to adhere to the comprehensive investigative protocols expected of a CIFR. This can result in either an unjustified denial of a legitimate claim or the failure to uncover significant fraudulent activity. Furthermore, an approach that bypasses established reporting procedures or fails to document findings meticulously would undermine the integrity of the investigation and hinder any subsequent legal or disciplinary actions, violating regulatory requirements for record-keeping and reporting. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the alleged fraudulent activity and the relevant policy provisions. This framework necessitates the development of a detailed investigative plan, the systematic collection and analysis of evidence, and the objective evaluation of findings against established fraud indicators and legal standards. Throughout the process, maintaining clear communication with relevant parties, adhering to confidentiality protocols, and documenting every step are paramount. The ultimate goal is to arrive at a well-supported conclusion that is defensible under regulatory scrutiny and upholds the ethical principles of the insurance profession. Question 7. Cost-benefit analysis shows that approving a business interruption claim as presented by the policyholder, despite some initial concerns about the extent of the loss, would result in a lower immediate payout compared to a protracted dispute and potential litigation. The policyholder's analysis highlights significant projected future profits that would be lost without the insurance coverage, framing the claim as essential for business survival. As a certified insurance fraud representative, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Approve the claim as presented, acknowledging the policyholder's cost-benefit analysis as a persuasive justification for the claimed losses and to avoid further expense and potential legal action. Option B. Focus on negotiating a settlement based on the policyholder's cost-benefit analysis, aiming to reach an agreement that minimizes the insurer's immediate financial exposure, even if it means overlooking potential discrepancies in the claimed losses. Option C. Advise the policyholder that their cost-benefit analysis is insufficient and request they revise it to reflect a more conservative estimate of losses before proceeding with any investigation. Option D. Conduct a thorough, independent investigation into the cause and extent of the business interruption, verifying all financial data and policy coverage, regardless of the claimant's cost-benefit analysis or the potential for immediate resolution. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough, independent investigation into the cause and extent of the business interruption, verifying all financial data and policy coverage, regardless of the claimant's cost-benefit analysis or the potential for immediate resolution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it pits the immediate financial benefit of a potentially fraudulent claim against the long-term integrity of the insurance industry and the representative's professional duty. The representative must exercise sound judgment to discern genuine business interruption losses from inflated or fabricated ones, especially when presented with a seemingly plausible narrative supported by a cost-benefit analysis that favors the claimant. The core of the challenge lies in upholding ethical standards and regulatory compliance when faced with pressure, whether explicit or implicit, to approve a claim that might be questionable. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective investigation that prioritizes factual evidence and adherence to policy terms and conditions over the claimant's presented cost-benefit analysis. This approach is ethically sound and regulatorily compliant because it upholds the principles of fair claims handling, prevents the exploitation of the insurance system, and protects policyholders who pay premiums in good faith. Specifically, it aligns with the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative, CIFR. Exams focus on identifying and preventing fraudulent activities. The representative's duty is to verify the legitimacy of the loss and the extent of the interruption, not to accept a self-serving financial projection at face value. This requires scrutinizing documentation, interviewing relevant parties, and applying policy definitions rigorously. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the claimant's cost-benefit analysis, without independent verification, fails to meet the professional standard of due diligence. This approach is ethically flawed as it risks facilitating fraud and is regulatorily non-compliant because it bypasses the necessary investigative steps required to ensure claims are valid and within policy coverage. Such an approach prioritizes expediency and potential claimant satisfaction over the insurer's obligation to prevent financial loss due to fraudulent activity. Another incorrect approach that involves accepting the claimant's narrative without question, even if the cost-benefit analysis appears favorable, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of critical thinking and a failure to exercise the investigative skills expected of a CIFR. It can lead to the payment of fraudulent claims, which erodes public trust in the insurance industry and can result in increased premiums for honest policyholders. A third incorrect approach that involves pressuring the claimant to reduce their claim based on the cost-benefit analysis, rather than investigating the validity of the original claim, is also problematic. While the goal might be to mitigate potential overpayment, it still fails to address the fundamental issue of claim verification and could be perceived as an attempt to avoid a thorough investigation, potentially leading to disputes and further complications. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Acknowledge the claimant's presented information, including any cost-benefit analysis, but do not accept it as definitive. 2. Initiate a comprehensive investigation to verify the reported loss, the cause of the business interruption, and the actual financial impact. 3. Scrutinize all supporting documentation and seek independent corroboration where necessary. 4. Apply the terms, conditions, and exclusions of the relevant business interruption policy to the verified facts. 5. Document all findings meticulously and base the claim's decision on objective evidence and policy provisions. 6. If fraud is suspected, follow established internal procedures for reporting and further investigation. Question 8. Market research demonstrates a significant increase in durable medical equipment, DME, claims submitted by a particular provider, with a pattern of billing for high-cost, complex equipment that appears to be disproportionate to the patient population's diagnosed conditions. Several claims also exhibit unusual coding practices and lack detailed medical necessity documentation. As a certified insurance fraud representative, CIFR, what is the most appropriate initial course of action? Option A. Advise the claims adjusters to approve all claims from this provider to avoid potential legal disputes while further research is conducted. Option B. Initiate a preliminary investigation to gather more information, including a review of claim data, billing patterns, and supporting documentation to assess the validity of the red flags. Option C. Immediately deny all future claims from this provider and report them to the relevant state insurance department for investigation. Option D. Contact the provider directly to inform them of the suspected fraud and request an explanation for the billing practices. The correct answer is C. Immediately deny all future claims from this provider and report them to the relevant state insurance department for investigation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a certified insurance fraud representative, CIFR, to navigate a complex situation involving potential durable medical equipment, DME, fraud without direct, irrefutable proof. The challenge lies in balancing the need to investigate suspicious activity with the imperative to avoid premature accusations or actions that could harm legitimate providers or patients. The CIFR must rely on established investigative protocols and regulatory guidelines to gather sufficient evidence before escalating. The correct approach involves initiating a preliminary investigation based on the observed red flags. This approach is right because it adheres to the principles of due diligence and evidence-based decision-making, which are foundational to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct in insurance fraud investigation. Specifically, it aligns with the CIFR mandate to identify and investigate potential fraud by systematically gathering information, reviewing documentation, and comparing billing practices against established norms and payer policies. This methodical process ensures that any subsequent actions are supported by a reasonable basis, thereby protecting both the insurer and the integrity of the claims process. An incorrect approach that involves immediately denying all claims from the provider or reporting the provider to regulatory bodies without further investigation is wrong. This premature action constitutes a failure to follow proper investigative procedures. It can lead to unwarranted penalties against legitimate providers, damage the insurer's reputation, and potentially violate due process rights. Such an approach bypasses the critical step of evidence collection and analysis, which is a fundamental requirement under insurance regulations designed to prevent arbitrary actions. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the red flags due to the absence of definitive proof, is also professionally unacceptable. This failure to investigate known indicators of potential fraud is a dereliction of duty for a CIFR. It allows fraudulent schemes to continue unchecked, leading to financial losses for the insurer and potentially harming policyholders. Regulatory frameworks expect fraud investigators to proactively address suspicious patterns, not to wait for absolute certainty before acting. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify and document all suspicious indicators or red flags. 2. Consult internal guidelines and relevant payer policies regarding DME billing and fraud detection. 3. Initiate a preliminary investigation, which may include data analysis, review of claim histories, and comparison with industry benchmarks. 4. If the preliminary investigation yields sufficient evidence of potential fraud, proceed to a more in-depth investigation, which might involve site visits, interviews, or detailed medical record reviews. 5. Only after accumulating substantial evidence, consider appropriate actions such as claim denial, referral to law enforcement, or recovery efforts, always in accordance with established protocols and legal requirements. Question 9. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of inflated material costs and duplicate invoicing for a large commercial construction project. The investigator's initial review suggests the potential for significant financial misrepresentation. What is the most appropriate next step for the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative (CIFR) to take, adhering strictly to the CIFR exam's regulatory framework and ethical guidelines? Option A. Immediately initiate a formal fraud investigation, gather all relevant project documentation, and consult with legal counsel to determine the best course of action for recovery and potential prosecution. Option B. Contact the contractor directly to discuss the discrepancies observed by the monitoring system and request an explanation. Option C. Close the claim file, as monitoring system alerts are not definitive proof of fraud. Option D. Issue a formal demand for repayment to the contractor based on the monitoring system's findings, without further investigation. Correct answer is A. Immediately initiate a formal fraud investigation, gather all relevant project documentation, and consult with legal counsel to determine the best course of action for recovery and potential prosecution. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance investigator to balance the need for thorough investigation with the imperative to act within the bounds of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The investigator must discern between legitimate business practices and fraudulent activities, particularly in the complex and often opaque world of construction projects. The pressure to resolve claims efficiently can sometimes conflict with the diligence required to uncover sophisticated fraud schemes. Careful judgment is essential to avoid both wrongful accusations and missed opportunities to prevent financial losses for the insurer and policyholders. Correct approach involves a systematic and evidence-based investigation that adheres strictly to the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative (CIFR) exam's regulatory framework, which emphasizes due diligence, proper documentation, and adherence to established investigative protocols. This approach prioritizes gathering objective evidence, cross-referencing information from multiple sources, and consulting with relevant experts or legal counsel when necessary. It ensures that any allegations of fraud are supported by concrete proof, thereby protecting the integrity of the investigative process and the insurer's interests while respecting the rights of all parties involved. This aligns with the CIFR mandate to uphold ethical standards and regulatory compliance in fraud detection and prevention. An incorrect approach that involves immediately escalating the matter to law enforcement based solely on the monitoring system's alert, without conducting a preliminary investigation to verify the alert's validity, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This premature action could lead to unwarranted scrutiny of legitimate parties, damage professional reputations, and potentially incur legal repercussions for the insurer due to unsubstantiated claims. It bypasses the investigative due diligence required by the CIFR framework, which mandates a thorough assessment of evidence before initiating formal proceedings. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the monitoring system's alert without any further inquiry, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to act on potentially critical indicators of fraud. The CIFR framework expects representatives to be proactive in identifying and investigating suspicious activities. Ignoring such alerts could result in substantial financial losses for the insurer and a breach of fiduciary duty to policyholders. It suggests a disregard for the tools and processes designed to mitigate fraud risk. A third incorrect approach, which is to confront the contractor directly with suspicions without sufficient corroborating evidence, is also problematic. While direct communication can sometimes be part of an investigation, doing so prematurely and without a solid foundation of evidence can alert potential fraudsters, allowing them to conceal or destroy evidence. This tactic can also jeopardize the investigator's ability to gather further information and may lead to legal challenges if the contractor feels wrongly accused. The CIFR ethical guidelines emphasize a methodical and evidence-driven approach to avoid such pitfalls. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured framework. 1. Initial assessment. Evaluate the information provided by the monitoring system, considering its source, reliability, and the specific nature of the alert. 2. Preliminary investigation. Conduct discrete inquiries to gather initial corroborating evidence. This might involve reviewing project documentation, cross-referencing invoices, and observing site activities. 3. Evidence gathering and analysis. Systematically collect and analyze all relevant evidence, ensuring it is documented meticulously and adheres to legal and regulatory standards. 4. Consultation. Seek advice from supervisors, legal counsel, or subject matter experts when the situation is complex or involves significant financial implications. 5. Action determination. Based on the totality of the evidence, decide on the appropriate course of action, which could range from closing the file to initiating a formal investigation, referring to law enforcement, or pursuing recovery efforts. 6. Documentation and reporting. Maintain comprehensive records of all investigative steps, findings, and decisions, ensuring compliance with reporting requirements. Question 10. What factors determine whether a provider's billing practices, specifically concerning upcoding, unbundling, and phantom billing, constitute fraudulent activity under the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative (CIFR) exam's regulatory framework? Option A. The presence of documented evidence that billed services do not align with patient records, that services are artificially separated for increased reimbursement, or that services are billed for without being rendered, supported by a comparative analysis of submitted claims against established coding guidelines and service delivery proof. Option B. A provider's self-declaration of billing complexities or the existence of multiple billing codes for a single patient encounter without independent verification of service delivery. Option C. The subjective perception of the claims investigator that a provider's billing methods appear unusually intricate or deviate from common practices, without concrete evidence of misrepresentation. Option D. The overall increase in a provider's billing revenue over a specific period, irrespective of the nature of the services billed or the supporting documentation. Correct answer is A. The presence of documented evidence that billed services do not align with patient records, that services are artificially separated for increased reimbursement, or that services are billed for without being rendered, supported by a comparative analysis of submitted claims against established coding guidelines and service delivery proof. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of billing practices and their potential for fraudulent intent, specifically within the context of upcoding, unbundling, and phantom billing. The representative must distinguish between legitimate billing variations and deliberate attempts to defraud the insurer, which necessitates a deep dive into documentation, service delivery records, and established coding guidelines. Careful judgment is required to avoid both overzealous accusations that could damage provider relationships and underestimation of sophisticated fraud schemes. The correct approach involves a thorough comparative analysis of billed services against documented patient encounters and established coding rules. This means verifying that the codes submitted accurately reflect the services rendered, that services are not being artificially separated, unbundled to increase reimbursement, and that phantom billing for services never provided, is not occurring. Regulatory justification stems from the fundamental principles of insurance contracts, which require truthful and accurate representation of claims. Specifically, regulations governing claims submission and provider conduct mandate that providers bill only for services actually performed and use appropriate coding to reflect those services. Ethical considerations demand honesty and integrity in all dealings with the insurer and policyholders. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the dollar amount of claims without investigating the underlying services is professionally unacceptable. This fails to address the core issue of whether the billing is legitimate or fraudulent. It represents a superficial review that could miss actual fraud or lead to incorrect accusations. Another incorrect approach that relies on provider self-reporting without independent verification is also flawed. While provider cooperation is valuable, it cannot replace the insurer's responsibility to conduct due diligence and investigate potential fraud. This approach risks overlooking deliberate misrepresentations and undermines the integrity of the claims review process. A third incorrect approach that assumes all complex billing is indicative of fraud without examining the specific circumstances and supporting documentation is equally problematic. This can lead to unwarranted investigations, damage professional relationships, and waste resources. It fails to acknowledge that complex medical procedures and billing can sometimes be legitimate, requiring careful scrutiny rather than blanket suspicion. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential red flags in billing patterns. This should be followed by a detailed review of supporting documentation, including medical records, invoices, and service logs. A comparative analysis against established coding standards and payer policies is crucial. If discrepancies or suspicious patterns emerge, further investigation, which may include interviews or audits, should be initiated. The ultimate goal is to gather sufficient evidence to determine if fraudulent intent is present, adhering strictly to regulatory requirements and ethical principles throughout the process. Question 11. Examination of the data shows an increasing number of suspicious claims across auto, property, and health insurance lines. As a certified insurance fraud representative, CIFR, which approach best facilitates a comprehensive understanding of potential fraud schemes across these diverse insurance lines for effective risk assessment. Option A. Develop a risk assessment framework that categorizes and analyzes common fraud typologies, red flags, and vulnerabilities specific to auto, property, and health insurance, identifying cross-line patterns. Option B. Prioritize investigations based on the total dollar amount of individual suspicious claims, irrespective of the insurance line. Option C. Conduct a detailed investigation into all suspicious auto insurance claims, as this line typically presents the highest volume of fraud. Option D. Focus solely on analyzing historical claims data for each insurance line independently to identify past fraudulent activities. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed investigation into all suspicious auto insurance claims, as this line typically presents the highest volume of fraud. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to synthesize information from disparate lines of business to identify potential systemic fraud patterns, rather than focusing on isolated incidents. The investigator must move beyond a reactive approach to fraud detection and adopt a proactive, risk-based methodology. This requires a deep understanding of how fraud schemes can manifest differently across various insurance products, while still sharing underlying commonalities in motivation and execution. Careful judgment is required to avoid jumping to conclusions based on limited data, and to ensure that investigative resources are allocated effectively. The correct approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that categorizes and analyzes fraud schemes across different insurance lines by identifying common typologies, red flags, and potential vulnerabilities inherent in each product. This aligns with the principles of effective fraud management, which emphasizes understanding the evolving landscape of fraudulent activities. By systematically evaluating the likelihood and impact of various fraud schemes across auto, property, and health insurance, an investigator can prioritize resources and develop targeted detection and prevention strategies. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining the integrity of the insurance market and protecting policyholders. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on a single insurance line, such as auto insurance, fails to acknowledge the interconnectedness of fraud and the potential for schemes to migrate or adapt across different product types. This narrow focus risks missing broader, more sophisticated fraud operations that may span multiple lines. Another incorrect approach that relies exclusively on historical claims data without considering emerging fraud trends or external factors overlooks the dynamic nature of insurance fraud. Fraudsters constantly adapt their methods, and a purely historical perspective can lead to outdated detection models. Finally, an approach that prioritizes only high-value claims without considering the cumulative impact of numerous smaller fraudulent claims neglects a significant portion of potential fraud losses and may miss indicators of organized fraud rings. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a broad understanding of the insurance fraud landscape, then drills down into specific product lines. This involves continuous learning about new fraud typologies, leveraging data analytics to identify anomalies and patterns, and collaborating with industry peers and law enforcement. A risk-based approach, where investigative efforts are directed towards areas with the highest potential for fraud, is paramount. This requires a balanced consideration of both the likelihood of fraud occurring and its potential financial impact, informed by a holistic view of all insurance lines. Question 12. When evaluating the implementation of a network intrusion detection and prevention system, NIPS, within an insurance company, which of the following best aligns with the regulatory framework for data protection and incident reporting for certified insurance fraud representatives? Option A. Relying solely on the NIPS to automatically block all suspicious traffic without human review or logging, assuming that all blocked activity is malicious and therefore does not require further reporting. Option B. Configuring the NIPS to log only essential system event data, establishing clear protocols for reviewing logs for suspicious activity, and ensuring a defined process for reporting detected intrusions that meet regulatory thresholds for notification to the appropriate authorities. Option C. Implementing the NIPS with minimal logging to reduce storage costs and only conducting manual log reviews on a quarterly basis, with reporting to regulatory bodies only occurring if a significant data breach is confirmed through external audits. Option D. Deploying the NIPS with broad logging capabilities to capture all network traffic for comprehensive analysis and only reporting detected intrusions to regulatory bodies if they result in direct financial loss to the company. The correct answer is D. Deploying the NIPS with broad logging capabilities to capture all network traffic for comprehensive analysis and only reporting detected intrusions to regulatory bodies if they result in direct financial loss to the company. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance fraud representative to balance the imperative of protecting sensitive customer data and company systems from cyber threats with the need to comply with specific regulatory reporting obligations. The representative must understand the nuances of network intrusion detection and prevention systems, NIPS, and how their operation intersects with legal and ethical duties. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the implementation and monitoring of NIPS do not inadvertently lead to breaches of privacy or violate data protection laws, while simultaneously ensuring that any detected intrusions are handled in accordance with reporting mandates. The correct approach involves a proactive and compliant strategy. This includes establishing clear policies and procedures for NIPS deployment, configuration, and incident response that explicitly align with the regulatory framework governing insurance operations and data privacy. This approach ensures that the company is not only technically secure, but also legally sound, minimizing the risk of regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Specifically, it requires understanding the reporting thresholds and timelines mandated by relevant regulations for data breaches or significant security incidents. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on technical detection and prevention without considering the regulatory implications of the data processed by the NIPS. For instance, logging excessive personal data without a legitimate business purpose or legal basis could violate data privacy regulations. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore or delay reporting a detected intrusion that meets the regulatory threshold for notification. This failure to report promptly can result in severe fines and legal repercussions, as it directly contravenes the transparency and accountability requirements of regulatory bodies. Furthermore, implementing NIPS without proper employee training on data handling and incident reporting protocols creates a significant risk of accidental noncompliance or mishandling of sensitive information. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory landscape before implementing or managing any technology that handles sensitive data. This involves conducting risk assessments that consider both technical vulnerabilities and regulatory compliance requirements. Regular training, clear policy documentation, and a robust incident response plan that includes defined reporting procedures are essential components of this framework. When faced with a detected intrusion, the professional must consult these established policies and regulatory guidelines to determine the appropriate course of action, including any mandatory reporting obligations. Question 13. The assessment process reveals a pattern of suspicious financial transactions associated with a series of insurance claims filed by a particular policyholder. As a certified insurance fraud representative, CIFR, you are tasked with investigating these transactions to determine if insurance fraud has occurred. You have identified that the policyholder's bank statements and transaction histories are likely to contain crucial evidence. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and legally compliant approach to obtaining and analyzing this financial information? Option A. Conduct a broad review of all financial documents associated with the policyholder, including personal and business accounts, to identify any anomalies, without specific legal authorization for each document. Option B. Immediately request the policyholder's bank statements directly from their financial institution, citing the ongoing fraud investigation. Option C. Obtain a court order or subpoena to compel the production of the policyholder's bank statements and transaction records, then employ forensic accounting techniques to analyze the relevant data. Option D. Rely on information provided by informants and publicly available data to infer the nature of the financial transactions, without directly accessing the policyholder's private financial records. The correct answer is B. Immediately request the policyholder's bank statements directly from their financial institution, citing the ongoing fraud investigation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the need to gather evidence for a fraud investigation and the obligation to maintain client confidentiality and adhere to data privacy regulations. The investigator must navigate a complex web of legal and ethical considerations, ensuring that the evidence obtained is admissible and that no privacy rights are violated. The potential for misinterpreting financial data or overstepping investigative boundaries necessitates a meticulous and legally sound approach. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic and legally compliant method of data acquisition. This entails obtaining the necessary legal authorizations, such as subpoenas or court orders, to access financial records. It also requires employing forensic accounting techniques that are recognized within the relevant regulatory framework for evidence gathering. This approach is justified by the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative (CIFR) exam's emphasis on adhering to legal statutes and ethical guidelines governing investigations. Specifically, it aligns with principles of due process, lawful evidence collection, and the protection of individual privacy rights as mandated by applicable insurance fraud investigation regulations. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves directly accessing and reviewing an insured's bank statements without proper legal authorization. This constitutes a significant breach of privacy laws and potentially violates data protection regulations. Such an action could render the evidence inadmissible in legal proceedings and expose the investigator and their organization to severe penalties, including fines and reputational damage. It directly contravenes the principle of lawful evidence acquisition. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on anecdotal information or suspicions without corroborating it with verifiable financial data obtained through legitimate means. While suspicion is a starting point, it is insufficient for building a case. This approach fails to meet the evidentiary standards required for fraud investigations and neglects the forensic accounting principles of objective analysis and data validation. It risks making unsubstantiated accusations and undermining the credibility of the investigation. A third incorrect approach is to conduct a broad, unfocused review of all available financial documents without a clear investigative objective or a defined scope. This can lead to the inadvertent collection of sensitive, irrelevant personal information, raising privacy concerns. Furthermore, it is inefficient and may result in the overlooking of crucial evidence due to the sheer volume of data. This approach lacks the precision and targeted methodology expected in forensic accounting. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory framework governing insurance fraud investigations in the relevant jurisdiction. 2. Identifying the precise nature of the suspected fraud to define the scope of the investigation. 3. Consulting with legal counsel to ensure all evidence-gathering methods are lawful and authorized. 4. Employing forensic accounting techniques that are both effective and compliant with privacy and data protection laws. 5. Maintaining meticulous documentation of all investigative steps and evidence obtained. Question 14. Cost-benefit analysis shows that while pursuing civil penalties can recover financial losses for the insurer, the potential for significant criminal sanctions, including imprisonment and substantial fines, serves as a more potent deterrent against widespread insurance fraud. In light of this, what is the most appropriate course of action for a certified insurance fraud representative (CIFR) when evidence strongly suggests an insured has engaged in deliberate misrepresentation to obtain a fraudulent claim payout. Option A. Publicly accuse the insured of criminal fraud on social media to shame them and deter others, without first consulting legal counsel or law enforcement. Option B. Conduct a thorough investigation, document all evidence of fraudulent intent and financial impact, and then present the findings to the insurer's legal department, and if warranted, recommend referral to the appropriate law enforcement or prosecutorial agencies for potential criminal investigation and prosecution. Option C. Immediately initiate civil litigation to recover all fraudulent payouts and associated investigation costs, while withholding any information that might lead to criminal charges to avoid complicating the civil case. Option D. Inform the insured that their claim is being denied due to suspected fraud and offer a settlement for a reduced payout to avoid the time and expense of further investigation or legal action. The correct answer is C. Immediately initiate civil litigation to recover all fraudulent payouts and associated investigation costs, while withholding any information that might lead to criminal charges to avoid complicating the civil case. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to navigate the complex interplay between civil and criminal penalties, understanding that actions taken in one realm can have significant repercussions in the other. The investigator must balance the insurer's need for restitution and deterrence with the potential for criminal prosecution, ensuring all actions are compliant with the specific regulatory framework governing the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative (CIFR) exam. This demands a thorough understanding of the relevant statutes and case law, as well as ethical considerations regarding fairness and due process. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation that meticulously gathers evidence of fraudulent intent and damages, preparing a comprehensive report that clearly delineates the findings. This report should then be presented to the appropriate internal stakeholders for a decision on whether to pursue civil remedies, such as rescission of the policy or recovery of fraudulent payments, or to refer the case to criminal authorities for prosecution. This approach is correct because it adheres to the principle of due diligence and respects the distinct legal processes for civil and criminal matters. It ensures that the insurer acts within its rights to recover losses, while also upholding its obligation to report potential criminal activity to the relevant authorities, thereby contributing to the integrity of the insurance market and deterring future fraud. This aligns with the CIFR mandate to uphold ethical standards and regulatory compliance in fraud investigation. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on recovering the insurer's financial losses through aggressive civil litigation, without considering the potential for criminal conduct. This fails to acknowledge the broader societal implications of insurance fraud and the role of criminal law in punishing egregious offenders. It also risks overstepping the bounds of civil remedies and potentially prejudicing a future criminal investigation. Another incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide to pursue criminal charges without proper referral to law enforcement or prosecutorial bodies. Investigators are not prosecutors, and their role is to gather and present evidence. Making such a determination bypasses the established legal procedures and could lead to procedural errors that jeopardize any potential prosecution. A further incorrect approach would be to ignore evidence of fraud due to a perceived low likelihood of successful prosecution or a desire to avoid the administrative burden of reporting. This abdication of responsibility undermines the purpose of fraud investigation and allows fraudulent actors to continue their activities, potentially harming other policyholders. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the evidence, a clear understanding of the applicable civil and criminal statutes, and consultation with legal counsel. Investigators should maintain objectivity, document all findings meticulously, and follow established protocols for case referral and disposition. Prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical conduct throughout the investigation is paramount. Question 15. Regulatory review indicates that an applicant for a life insurance policy has listed a business partner as the beneficiary, but has not clearly articulated the nature of their insurable interest beyond a general statement of mutual business reliance. The applicant's initial application materials contain some inconsistencies regarding the duration and financial contribution to the business. As a certified insurance fraud representative, CIFR. What is the most appropriate course of action to address this potential insurable interest issue and any associated fraudulent application concerns? Option A. Advise the applicant to amend their application to name a family member as beneficiary, as this is a more straightforward insurable interest to verify. Option B. Immediately escalate the case for potential fraud investigation and denial based on the initial inconsistencies and lack of clear insurable interest. Option C. Conduct a detailed investigation to gather evidence supporting or refuting the applicant's insurable interest, including reviewing business documentation and interviewing relevant parties before making any determination. Option D. Proceed with issuing the policy as applied for, assuming the applicant has a legitimate insurable interest and that the inconsistencies are minor clerical errors. The correct answer is B. Immediately escalate the case for potential fraud investigation and denial based on the initial inconsistencies and lack of clear insurable interest. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to navigate the delicate balance between identifying potential fraud and respecting the applicant's right to privacy and fair treatment, all while adhering strictly to the regulatory framework governing insurance applications and insurable interest. The investigator must exercise careful judgment to distinguish between genuine misrepresentation, which may be fraudulent, and a misunderstanding or omission that does not rise to the level of fraud. The core of the challenge lies in the potential for an applicant to misrepresent or omit information regarding their insurable interest, either intentionally to gain coverage they are not entitled to, or unintentionally due to a lack of understanding. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation into the applicant's stated insurable interest, gathering evidence to corroborate or refute their claims, and consulting relevant policy provisions and regulatory guidance. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the potential fraud by verifying the fundamental requirement of insurable interest, which is a cornerstone of insurance law. By gathering objective evidence and applying established policy terms, the investigator acts in accordance with the regulatory framework that mandates insurers to underwrite policies based on a legitimate insurable interest to prevent wagering and moral hazard. This methodical and evidence-based approach ensures that any determination of fraud is well-founded and defensible, protecting both the insurer and the integrity of the insurance market. An incorrect approach would be to immediately deny the claim or report suspected fraud solely based on an initial discrepancy without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge the possibility of innocent error or misunderstanding, potentially leading to an unfair outcome for the applicant and a breach of professional duty. Another incorrect approach would be to overlook the discrepancy entirely, assuming good faith without verification. This neglects the investigator's responsibility to identify and investigate potential fraud, thereby exposing the insurer to risk and undermining the principles of sound underwriting. A third incorrect approach might involve making assumptions about the applicant's intent without sufficient evidence, which is speculative and unprofessional, and could lead to incorrect conclusions and actions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, clearly identify the specific regulatory requirements and policy terms related to insurable interest. Second, gather all available information and evidence pertaining to the applicant's stated insurable interest. Third, conduct a thorough investigation to corroborate or refute this information, seeking objective proof. Fourth, analyze the findings against the regulatory framework and policy conditions to determine if a misrepresentation or omission has occurred, and crucially, if there is evidence of fraudulent intent. Finally, consult with legal or underwriting departments as necessary before making a final determination. Question 16. The performance metrics show a significant increase in the speed of claim closure for fire-related incidents, but there are also concerns about a potential rise in undetected arson-for-profit schemes. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for efficient claim processing with the imperative to thoroughly investigate potential arson-for-profit and related schemes, in accordance with the principles expected of a certified insurance fraud representative? Option A. Rely on the fire department's initial assessment of the fire's cause and proceed with claim payment unless there is direct, irrefutable evidence of arson presented by law enforcement. Option B. Focus investigative efforts primarily on the monetary value of the claim allocating more resources to larger claims while treating smaller claims with less scrutiny. Regardless of suspicious circumstances, Option C, conduct a comprehensive review of the insured's financial stability, business operations, and the detailed findings of the fire investigation report, cross-referencing these with known arson for profit indicators before authorizing claim payment. Option D, prioritize closing claims rapidly to meet performance targets, focusing only on obvious indicators of fraud and deferring deeper investigation to a later stage if suspicions arise. The correct answer is D. Prioritize closing claims rapidly to meet performance targets, focusing only on obvious indicators of fraud and deferring deeper investigation to a later stage if suspicions arise. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires investigators to distinguish between legitimate business challenges and potential fraudulent activity, particularly arson for profit, which is a complex and often meticulously planned crime. The pressure to demonstrate results through performance metrics can inadvertently lead to a focus on quantity over quality of investigations, potentially causing investigators to overlook subtle but critical indicators of fraud. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for efficiency with the thoroughness demanded by regulatory frameworks and ethical obligations to uphold the integrity of the insurance system. The correct approach involves a comprehensive review of the insured's financial history, business operations, and the circumstances surrounding the fire, cross-referencing these with known arson for profit indicators. This approach is right because it aligns with the Certified Insurance Fraud Representative (CIFR) exam's focus on understanding and identifying complex fraud schemes. Specifically, it adheres to the principles of due diligence and investigative thoroughness mandated by insurance regulations that require insurers to act in good faith and to investigate claims diligently. Ethically, this approach upholds the CIFR commitment to combating insurance fraud and protecting policyholders and the public from its detrimental effects. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the speed of claim closure, without adequate investigation into the fire's cause or the insured's financial distress, fails to meet regulatory standards for claim investigation. This oversight can lead to the improper payment of fraudulent claims, which is a direct violation of insurance laws, and can result in financial losses for the insurer and increased premiums for honest policyholders. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or unsubstantiated suspicions without concrete supporting documentation or investigative steps is also professionally unacceptable. This violates the principles of evidence-based investigation and can lead to wrongful accusations or the overlooking of genuine fraud. Regulatory frameworks emphasize the need for objective evidence and a systematic investigative process. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes meeting performance metrics by closing cases quickly, even if it means deferring deeper investigation into suspicious circumstances, demonstrates a failure to uphold the core responsibilities of an insurance fraud representative. This can lead to a pattern of paying fraudulent claims, undermining the insurer's financial stability, and potentially violating regulatory requirements for fraud prevention and detection. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly understand the claim and the circumstances. Second, identify potential red flags for arson for profit, such as financial distress, prior fires, or suspicious fire patterns. Third, gather and analyze all available evidence, including financial records, witness statements, and fire investigation reports. Fourth, consult with subject matter experts, such as fire investigators and forensic accountants, when necessary. And fifth, make a determination based on the totality of the evidence, adhering to regulatory requirements and ethical principles, rather than solely on performance metrics. Question 17. Governance review demonstrates that a significant number of complex insurance fraud investigations initiated by your organization involve entities operating across multiple states and potentially engaging in activities that fall under both state insurance department and federal oversight. To ensure efficient and compliant investigation and reporting, which of the following actions best reflects the appropriate engagement with regulatory agencies? Option A. Immediately report all complex cross-jurisdictional fraud cases to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, as they possess broad investigative powers. Option B. Proactively identify the primary state insurance department with jurisdiction over the majority of the alleged fraudulent activity and initiate a formal information sharing agreement with them, while also preparing a comprehensive report for potential referral to the appropriate federal agency if initial findings suggest federal involvement. Option C. Focus solely on gathering evidence for internal disciplinary action and recovery, assuming that regulatory agencies will be notified by other means if deemed necessary. Option D. Contact the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, for guidance, as any large-scale financial fraud ultimately falls under their purview. The correct answer is B. Proactively identify the primary state insurance department with jurisdiction over the majority of the alleged fraudulent activity and initiate a formal information sharing agreement with them, while also preparing a comprehensive report for potential referral to the appropriate federal agency if initial findings suggest federal involvement. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to navigate the complex and often overlapping responsibilities of various regulatory bodies. The investigator must understand which agency has primary oversight for specific types of insurance fraud and how to effectively collaborate with them to ensure proper investigation and prosecution. Misinterpreting these roles can lead to delayed investigations, missed opportunities for enforcement, and potential legal challenges. The correct approach involves identifying the specific nature of the alleged fraud and then determining the primary regulatory agency responsible for that sector. For example, if the fraud involves a federally chartered insurance company, the oversight body might differ from a state-regulated entity. The investigator must then engage with the appropriate agency, providing them with all necessary documentation and evidence, while also understanding the limitations and reporting requirements of their own organization. This aligns with the principles of interagency cooperation and adherence to jurisdictional mandates, ensuring that investigations are conducted efficiently and effectively within the established legal framework. An incorrect approach would be to assume a single agency has universal jurisdiction over all insurance fraud. This failure ignores the nuanced regulatory landscape and can lead to misdirected efforts and wasted resources. Another incorrect approach is to bypass established reporting channels and directly contact law enforcement without first consulting the relevant regulatory body. This can undermine the regulatory process and may be seen as an overreach of authority. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on internal company policy without considering external regulatory obligations is also flawed, as it fails to acknowledge the broader legal and ethical responsibilities of an insurance fraud investigator. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the alleged fraud's characteristics. This includes identifying the type of insurance, the entities involved, and the potential scope of the fraudulent activity. Subsequently, the investigator must consult relevant regulatory guidelines and statutes to pinpoint the primary oversight body. Collaboration and clear communication with the identified agency are paramount, ensuring that all actions are taken in accordance with jurisdictional authority and reporting protocols. Question 18. Quality control measures reveal that an investigator, responding to a suspected staged automobile accident, has collected digital evidence from a witness's mobile phone and physical evidence from the accident scene. The investigator has secured these items but has not yet formally logged them into the evidence repository or initiated a detailed chain of custody record for either. The investigator is considering immediately sending the digital evidence to an external forensic analyst for preliminary review and placing the physical evidence in a temporary, unsecured location within their office until they have more time to process it. Which of the following approaches best adheres to established evidence collection and preservation standards for an insurance fraud investigation? Option A. Send the digital evidence to an external, unvetted third party for immediate analysis and store the physical evidence in the investigator's personal workspace to await further processing. Option B. Immediately initiate a formal chain of custody for both the digital and physical evidence, securely store them in designated evidence lockers, and then arrange for the digital evidence to be transferred to a vetted forensic analyst under strict chain of custody protocols, while the physical evidence is processed according to standard operating procedures. Option C. Place the physical evidence in a temporary, unsecured location within the investigator's office and await a more convenient time to begin the chain of custody process for both evidence types. Option D. delay formal logging and chain of custody documentation until the end of the investigator's shift, assuming the evidence is safe in their possession. The correct answer is B. Immediately initiate a formal chain of custody for both the digital and physical evidence, securely store them in designated evidence lockers, and then arrange for the digital evidence to be transferred to a vetted forensic analyst under strict chain of custody protocols, while the physical evidence is processed according to standard operating procedures. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to balance the urgent need to secure potentially crucial evidence with the strict legal and ethical obligations surrounding evidence collection and preservation. The investigator must act decisively to prevent evidence spoliation, while simultaneously adhering to established protocols that ensure the evidence's admissibility in legal proceedings and maintain the integrity of the investigation. Failure to do so can compromise the entire case, lead to disciplinary action, and undermine public trust in the insurance industry. The correct approach involves meticulously documenting the chain of custody for all collected evidence. This means creating a clear, unbroken record of who handled the evidence, when, where, and for what purpose, from the moment it was collected until it is presented in court or otherwise disposed of. This practice is directly mandated by legal principles governing evidence admissibility, such as those found in the Federal Rules of Evidence, if the exam jurisdiction is U.S.-based, or equivalent statutes in other jurisdictions. A robust chain of custody ensures the evidence's authenticity and integrity, preventing challenges regarding tampering or contamination. It demonstrates due diligence and adherence to established investigative procedures, which are often implicitly or explicitly required by regulatory bodies overseeing insurance investigations. An incorrect approach would be to immediately share the sensitive digital evidence with an external, unvetted third party without establishing a secure transfer protocol or documenting the transfer. This violates the principle of maintaining control over evidence and risks unauthorized access, alteration, or loss, thereby breaking the chain of custody and rendering the evidence inadmissible. It also potentially violates data privacy regulations and company policy regarding the handling of sensitive information. Another incorrect approach would be to store the collected physical evidence in a disorganized manner within the investigator's personal workspace without proper labeling or environmental controls. This increases the risk of damage, loss, or contamination, compromising the evidence's integrity and making it difficult to establish a reliable chain of custody. Such negligence can be viewed as a failure to exercise reasonable care, potentially violating internal company policies and investigative standards. A third incorrect approach would be to delay the formal logging and securing of the evidence until the end of the day, assuming it is safe in the investigator's possession. This creates a gap in the chain of custody, during which the evidence's integrity could be compromised without a record. It also increases the likelihood of misplacement or accidental destruction, as the evidence is not yet formally accounted for within the investigative system. This demonstrates a lack of adherence to immediate evidence handling protocols, which are critical for maintaining a defensible chain of custody. Professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, identify the nature of the evidence and its potential evidentiary value. Second, immediately implement appropriate collection and preservation techniques based on the evidence type: digital, physical, testimonial. Third, meticulously document every step of the collection and handling process, paying particular attention to establishing and maintaining the chain of custody. Fourth, consult internal policies and relevant legal guidelines to ensure compliance. Finally, secure the evidence in an appropriate, controlled environment and ensure it is formally logged into the investigative system as soon as possible. Question 19. Research into a medical insurance fraud investigation reveals a pattern of unusually high billing for specific diagnostic procedures submitted by a particular healthcare provider. The investigator suspects fraudulent upcoding or phantom billing. What is the most compliant and ethically sound approach to gather further evidence? Option A. Share the initial suspicions and preliminary findings with other insurance carriers to see if they have encountered similar issues with the provider. Option B. Conduct surveillance of the healthcare provider's premises to observe patient flow and billing practices without any prior legal authorization. Option C. Obtain a subpoena for the relevant patient records and billing information from the healthcare provider, detailing the specific timeframes and procedures in question. Option D. Directly access the healthcare provider's electronic health record system to review patient charts and billing details related to the suspicious procedures. The correct answer is D. Directly access the healthcare provider's electronic health record system to review patient charts and billing details related to the suspicious procedures. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an insurance fraud investigator to balance the need to gather evidence of potential medical insurance fraud with the strict regulatory requirements governing patient privacy and data handling. Misinterpreting or failing to adhere to these regulations can lead to severe legal and ethical consequences, including the dismissal of evidence, civil penalties, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to ensure that investigative actions are both effective in uncovering fraud and fully compliant with the law. The correct approach involves meticulously documenting all investigative steps and ensuring that any information obtained is done so through legally permissible channels, respecting patient confidentiality as mandated by relevant regulations. This includes obtaining necessary authorizations or warrants when required, and ensuring that all collected data is handled and stored securely to prevent unauthorized access or disclosure. This approach is justified by the principle of lawful investigation and the ethical obligation to protect sensitive patient information, as often stipulated in insurance fraud investigation guidelines and privacy laws. An incorrect approach that involves directly accessing a healthcare provider's internal patient billing system without proper legal authorization or a subpoena is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action constitutes a breach of patient privacy laws and potentially unauthorized access to computer systems, which can lead to severe penalties. Another incorrect approach, which is to rely solely on anonymous tips without independent verification or corroboration through legal means, fails to meet the standard of due diligence required for building a credible case and may violate principles of fairness and due process. Finally, an approach that involves sharing preliminary findings with unauthorized third parties before a formal investigation is complete and evidence is substantiated is a breach of confidentiality and can jeopardize the investigation and lead to legal repercussions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical conduct. This involves understanding the specific regulatory landscape governing insurance fraud investigations and patient data. Before taking any investigative action, professionals should assess the legality and ethical implications, consulting with legal counsel when necessary. They should always seek to obtain information through authorized channels, maintain thorough documentation of all activities, and ensure that evidence is collected and handled in a manner that upholds both the integrity of the investigation and the rights of individuals. Question 20. To address the challenge of a death benefit claim where the beneficiary's relationship to the deceased and the circumstances of death appear unusual, what is the most appropriate best practice approach for an insurance fraud investigator? Option A. Conduct a thorough investigation, including verifying the beneficiary's identity and relationship to the deceased, corroborating the cause and circumstances of death through independent sources, and reviewing policy documentation for any suspicious clauses or omissions, while maintaining strict confidentiality and adhering to all privacy regulations. Option B. Immediately deny the claim based on the initial unusual circumstances, informing the beneficiary that further investigation is not warranted due to suspicion. Option C. Share the claimant's personal information and details of the suspicious claim with other insurance companies and industry databases without explicit consent to solicit their findings. Option D. Accept the submitted death certificate and beneficiary designation at face value and process the claim promptly to avoid delays and potential complaints, assuming the documentation is accurate. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough investigation, including verifying the beneficiary's identity and relationship to the deceased, corroborating the cause and circumstances of death through independent sources, and reviewing policy documentation for any suspicious clauses or omissions, while maintaining strict confidentiality and adhering to all privacy regulations. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a sensitive claim with potential for significant financial loss and reputational damage to the insurer. The core difficulty lies in balancing the insurer's obligation to pay legitimate claims with the imperative to prevent fraudulent payouts. A thorough investigation is crucial to distinguish between genuine misfortune and deliberate deception, requiring a nuanced understanding of beneficiary relationships, policy terms, and the legal framework governing insurance claims. The correct approach involves a comprehensive and systematic investigation that meticulously gathers and analyzes all relevant documentation, interviews key individuals, and seeks corroborating evidence to establish the legitimacy of the death and the beneficiary's claim. This approach aligns with the regulatory framework for insurance claims handling, which mandates fair and prompt payment of valid claims, while also empowering insurers to investigate suspicious circumstances. Specifically, it adheres to principles of due diligence, requiring the insurer to act in good faith and with reasonable care. The ethical obligation to protect policyholder funds from fraudulent disbursement is paramount, and this approach ensures that decisions are based on factual evidence rather than assumptions or incomplete information. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the beneficiary's submitted documentation without independent verification fails to meet the standard of due diligence. This could lead to a fraudulent payout, violating the insurer's duty to its policyholders and potentially contravening regulations that require robust fraud prevention measures. Another incorrect approach, which prematurely denies the claim based on suspicion alone without a thorough investigation, risks violating regulations that mandate fair claims handling and could expose the insurer to legal challenges and reputational damage. Furthermore, an approach that involves sharing sensitive claimant information with unauthorized third parties, even if seemingly related to the investigation, constitutes a breach of privacy regulations and ethical conduct. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly understand the policy provisions and the claimant's submitted evidence. Second, identify potential red flags or inconsistencies that warrant further investigation. Third, develop a detailed investigation plan, outlining the steps to gather evidence, interview relevant parties, and consult with subject matter experts if necessary. Fourth, critically evaluate all gathered evidence, seeking corroboration and assessing its credibility. Finally, make a determination based on the preponderance of evidence, adhering strictly to regulatory requirements and ethical guidelines, and documenting all steps taken and the rationale for the decision.